You believe the bigger side wins, the stronger, the one with more weapons, more soldiers, more resources. But in June 1967, 50,000 men destroyed 450,000 in just 6 days. And what happened in those 6 days wasn't just a war. It was the most brutal manifestation of a psychological principle that determines winners and losers in every aspect of life. Everything you learned about victory is completely wrong. Because you were taught that strength is about size, that numbers decide conflicts, that material superiority guarantees success. But the truth is the opposite. On June 5, 1967, at 7:45 a.m., Israel was surrounded by 450,000 enemy soldiers. It had only 50,000 active men. It was outnumbered 9-1 in manpower. In tanks, 3.5-1. In combat aircraft, 3-1. 6 days later, Israel had conquered territories 3 times larger than its own country, destroyed over 90% of enemy air power, killed 15,000 opposing soldiers while losing only 1,000 of its own. How? Not through strength, through understanding something their enemies completely ignored: the psychology of action before fear paralyzes. And this principle doesn't just apply to wars. It applies to everything in your life where you feel surrounded, outnumbered, without chances. To understand what Israel did in June 1967, you need to grasp a fundamental principle of human psychology: analysis paralysis. When you face overwhelming threat, your brain does one thing. It calculates, measures, compares, analyzes all variables. And the greater the threat, the more time your brain spends on this analysis, searching for the perfect solution, the ideal moment, the flawless strategy. That survival instinct, right? Assess before acting? Wrong. Because while you analyze, the siege tightens, options diminish, time runs out, and what began as caution transforms into complete paralysis. That's exactly what happened with Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq in May 1967.
They had devastating numerical superiority. They had Israel completely surrounded. They had mutual defense pacts. Attacking one meant war against all. They had every advantage. So they did what any power believing in its own invincibility does. They waited, calculated, prepared the perfect attack. Egyptian President Nasser closed the Strait of Tiran, Israel's only outlet to the Red Sea, in May, a clear act of war, then mobilized 150,000 soldiers at the border, and then waited. Syria positioned its troops in the Golan Heights, waited. Iraq sent expeditionary forces to Jordan, waited. Everyone waited for the perfect moment, for total coordination, for the synchronized attack that would guarantee absolute victory. And while they waited, Israel understood something devastating. When you're surrounded and outnumbered, there's no perfect moment. There's only action or death. That's the psychological difference between those who survive and those who are destroyed when odds are impossible. Survivors don't wait for certainty. They act before paralysis consumes them. June 5, 1967, 7:45 a.m. 178 Israeli fighters, almost the entire country's air force, took flight, not to defend, to attack. They flew over the Mediterranean Sea, very low altitude, avoiding radars, entering Egypt from the rear. And at 8:15 a.m., they attacked air bases in Egypt's interior while Egyptian pilots were still having breakfast. In 30 minutes, over 340 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Over 90% of Egypt's air force ceased to exist without a single air combat. 90 MiG-21, Fighters at the time the most modern and feared in the world became scrap before takeoff. Simultaneously, 35,000 Israeli soldiers and 500 tanks advanced against 100,000 entrenched Egyptians in the Sinai Peninsula. The Egyptians expected an attack from the north at the Syrian border, based on a false Soviet report indicating Israeli troop concentration there. Israel attacked from the south, where nobody expected.
This is the second layer of the psychological principle. Overconfident enemies always prepare defenses based on their own expectations, not on the adversary's reality. And when you act outside those expectations, you don't just surprise, you completely break their mental structure. Within 24 hours, the Egyptian army was in total collapse, not because it was massacred in combat, though it was, but because psychologically their reality crumbled. They believed they had air superiority, lost it in 30 minutes. They believed Israel would attack the north, were attacked from the south. They believed they had time to coordinate. They didn't. And when reality and expectation separate so violently, the human mind doesn't adapt quickly. It goes into shock, cognitive collapse. Egyptian commanders gave orders for positions that no longer existed. Soldiers waited for reinforcements that had already been destroyed. Tank columns retreated to defensive lines that had already been overrun. This is the anatomy of psychological collapse on a massive scale. Let me show you exactly how this manifested in concrete details. June 5th, late afternoon, Israeli forces reach Ketef, a triple Egyptian defensive line hastily assembled. At 10 p.m., Israel fires 6,000 artillery shells in just 20 minutes. To this day, the largest artillery bombardment in Israeli military history. It wasn't to destroy defenses, though it did. It was to psychologically break any remnant of organized resistance. And it worked. June 6th, the 38th Armored Division, commanded by then Major General Ariel Sharon, who decades later would become Prime Minister, attacks Ketef. End of day, 14 Israelis killed, 41 wounded, 300 Egyptians killed, over 100 captured. But here's the devastating detail. It wasn't Israeli force that won. It was Egyptian psychological collapse. With Air Force destroyed and Ketef lost, President Nasser ordered total withdrawal from Sinai Peninsula at the end of June 6th, but gave no detailed instructions.
Result? Total panic. Disorganized retreat. Soldiers abandoning equipment. Entire units dissolving. And while Egyptians fled in chaos, Israelis advanced cohesively and uniformly. In the following 2 days, over 10,000 Egyptian soldiers were killed. Thousands died not in combat, but from hunger, thirst, and heat stroke in the desert, fleeing an enemy that barely needed to pursue them. On the night between June 5th and 8th, just 3 days after the war began, Israel controlled the entire Sinai Peninsula and surrounded what remained of the Egyptian army. And then something happened that reveals the depth of Arab psychological collapse. While Israel destroyed Egypt to the south, it remained defensive in the north against Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. But President Nasser, realizing his imminent defeat, sent false reports to allies indicating Egypt was winning. He asked them to attack from the north to make victory even more complete. At 10:30 a.m. on June 5th, Israel sent a message to King Hussein of Jordan, "Stay out of the war." The king's response? Too late, the dice are cast. Believing Nasser's false report, the Jordanian king ordered full advance at 11:15 a.m. At 1 p.m., Israel attacked Jordanian air bases exactly when planes were refueling. Total carnage. Practically the entire Jordanian Air Force destroyed on the ground. On land, Israel surrounded Jerusalem. Bloody urban battles. Jordanians entrenched in every building. Between June 5th and 7th, Jerusalem was the scene of merciless combat. Israeli Uzi submachine guns versus Jordanian AK-47 rifles. Close-range combat, bunkers, streets, house by house. Syria, also deceived by Nasser's report, attacked, but its advance was immediately halted.
In the Golan Heights, intense battles, fortified zones, elevated terrain favoring Syrian defenders. But again, Israeli Uzis in urban and close combat versus Syrian AK-47s designed for open areas. Israeli tactical advantage not through superior weapons, but through understanding of environment and adaptation.
6 days after the beginning, Israel conquered entire Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, territories from Jordan and Syria. Casualties: Israel 1,000 killed, 4,500 wounded. Arabs 15,000 killed, 20,000 wounded, tens of thousands captured. On June 10th, shameful armistice signed by Arabs. The Egyptian army was in ruins. Jewish holy sites in Jerusalem, including the Western Wall, were recovered. But here's the revelation that makes this story truly disturbing. 9 days after the stunning victory, Israel offered to return all conquered territories to Egypt and Syria. In exchange, it asked for just one thing: recognition of Israel's existence. The Arab response in September 1967: no Arab country will recognize Israel. There will be no peace. There will be no negotiation. This means Israel fought a survival war, won against impossible odds, offered to return everything conquered in exchange only for recognition, and was rejected. This refusal would lead to the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Arabs attacked Israel by surprise during the holiest Jewish holiday. And even after another devastating Arab defeat, Sinai Peninsula was only returned to Egypt in 1978, after agreements mediated by the U.S. Israel only left Gaza Strip in 2005. So what's the deep psychological principle here? It's not about war. It's about survival when you're surrounded. Most people, when facing overwhelming threat, do what Arab armies did: wait, calculate, search for the perfect moment, the flawless strategy. And while waiting, paralysis sets in. Options diminish. The siege tightens. Israel taught something brutal in June 1967. When you're outnumbered and surrounded, there's no perfect strategy. There's only decisive action before fear freezes you. But there's a second layer even deeper. Israel didn't just win because it acted first. It won because it understood enemy psychology better than they understood themselves. It knew numerical superiority breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds complacency. It knew coalitions based on common hatred are fragile, because when one member collapses, everyone's confidence crumbles. It knew armies that wait too long for the perfect moment lose the ability to act when chaos begins. And it exploited each of these psychological vulnerabilities with surgical precision, attacked where they didn't expect, when they didn't expect, how they didn't expect, destroyed not just bodies, but certainties. And when you destroy the certainties of an overconfident enemy, you don't need to defeat them completely. They defeat themselves. So what should you learn from this? That in any situation where you're surrounded by problems, by adversaries, by impossible circumstances, there are two paths. One, wait for the perfect moment, for the flawless strategy, for certainty before acting, and die slowly while options disappear. Two, understand that when odds are impossible, there's no perfect moment. There's only action before paralysis consumes you. Israel had 50,000 men against 450,000, but acted while others calculated. Had fewer planes, but attacked while enemies still believed they had time. Was surrounded, but transformed siege into advantage, because it knew exactly where all enemies were, while they didn't know where Israel would strike. That's the difference between survivors and victims. Survivors don't wait for advantages. They create advantages through action when everyone expects inaction. And there's an even deeper lesson here. Israel offered to return everything, asked only for recognition, was rejected. You know what this teaches? That victory isn't about conquering territory. It's about breaking the adversary's illusion. Israel didn't need to keep Sinai, didn't need the Golan Heights, didn't need East Jerusalem, though it was sacred. It only needed its enemies to stop believing they could destroy it. And the Six-Day War did exactly that. Broke the illusion of Arab invincibility so completely that decades later, that war still defines the region's psychology.
You probably won't ever face 450,000 enemy soldiers, but you will face situations where you're surrounded, outnumbered, without apparent chances. And in that moment, remember June 5, 1967. Remember that 50,000 men defeated 450,000 not because they were stronger, but because they acted while others waited for the perfect moment that would never come. Remember that numerical superiority is illusion when you understand psychology better than your adversary. Remember that sieges are only fatal if you wait to be rescued, but if you act before fear paralyzes, the siege becomes advantage, because you know where everyone is, and they don't know where you'll strike. The Six-Day War wasn't about tanks and planes. It was about brutal understanding of a psychological principle, decisive action before cognitive paralysis, transforming enemy numerical advantage into your death sentence. And this principle doesn't just apply to wars. It applies to everything where you're outnumbered and need to survive. If you want to keep descending into the depths where strategy, psychology, and survival converge, where the uncomfortable truths nobody teaches determine who lives and who dies, subscribe now, because this is the reality they don't want you to understand. That victory isn't about size. It's about timing, action, and psychological understanding. Israel proved this in 6 days and changed history forever.